In 1994, RadioShack operated more than 7,000 stores worldwide. Its red and white sign was embedded in shopping centers, strip malls, and downtown corners across the United States. For decades, it had been the most accessible electronics retailer in the country. If a household needed a battery, a cable, a telephone, or a small electronic component, RadioShack was usually the closest option. By the mid-1990s, it was still profitable, still expanding, and still recognizable to multiple generations of consumers. 20 years later, most of those stores were gone. RadioShack began as a parts business. Founded in Boston in the 1920s, it initially served amateur radio operators who needed components rather than finished products. That orientation toward hobbyists and tinkerers shaped the company's identity for decades. When it was acquired by Tandy Corporation in the 1960s, the business shifted from mail-order parts into physical retail. The strategy was simple and, for a long time, effective. Small stores, standardized layouts, and a broad assortment of electronic items that were difficult to find elsewhere. By the 1970s and 1980s, RadioShack had become a gateway to consumer electronics. It sold radios, stereos, calculators, early personal computers, and branded devices manufactured under the Tandy name. Many consumers encountered their first computer through a RadioShack TRS-80. The company's scale allowed it to experiment with private label products and to place stores in locations too small to support larger electronics retailers. The stores were compact, inexpensive to operate, and dense enough that convenience became a competitive advantage. This model appeared stable well into the 1990s. Consumer electronics were becoming more central to daily life, not less. Demand for phones, accessories, and home devices was growing. RadioShack's leadership believed that its nationwide footprint and brand familiarity insulated it from competition. The stores were close to customers, the inventory was broad, and the margins on accessories were high. From inside the company, the business did not look fragile. The broader retail environment, however, was already changing. Big-box competitors such as Best Buy and Circuit City were expanding rapidly. They offered wider selections of finished products, aggressive pricing, and in-store demonstrations that RadioShack's small footprints could not easily replicate. At the same time, manufacturers were becoming more powerful, marketing directly to consumers and standardizing components that once required specialized retail knowledge. RadioShack responded incrementally. It adjusted product mixes, reduced emphasis on hobbyist components, and leaned more heavily into consumer phones and accessories. This shift made sense on paper. The average customer no longer built radios from parts. They wanted ready-to-use devices. Cellular phones, in particular, appeared to offer recurring traffic and higher transaction values. Selling phone contracts also generated commissions that could offset declining sales in other categories. The move toward wireless retail reshaped the stores. Component drawers gave way to phone displays. Sales associates were trained less as electronics generalists and more as contract sales representatives. The company partnered with major carriers and devoted increasing floor space to mobile phones and accessories. In the short term, this strategy worked. Wireless sales grew, and RadioShack remained relevant in a rapidly evolving market. But the shift introduced new dependencies. Carrier relationships limited pricing flexibility. Inventory decisions were increasingly constrained by external partners. The sales process became more transactional and less exploratory, reducing one of the store's historical advantages. At the same time, online retail was beginning to change consumer expectations around selection and convenience. E-commerce did not immediately destroy RadioShack's business, but it eroded its margins and relevance. Items that once required a trip to a specialized store could now be ordered online, often at lower prices. Cables, adapters, and components, the products that once defined RadioShack, became commodities. The company's dense store network, once an asset, became a fixed cost burden. Leadership recognized these pressures but faced limited options. Closing stores risked weakening the brand and reducing scale advantages. Expanding store size was impractical given lease structures and locations. Investing heavily in e-commerce would require capital the company was increasingly reluctant to deploy, particularly as short-term performance came under scrutiny. RadioShack's ownership structure further complicated decision-making. As a public company, it faced pressure to deliver quarterly results. Cost-cutting became a recurring response to declining margins. Store labor was reduced, inventory was tightened, and marketing budgets fluctuated. These measures preserved cash but often degraded the in-store experience, making it harder to differentiate from competitors. By the mid-2000s, the electronics retail landscape was consolidating. Circuit City, once a peer, struggled and ultimately collapsed. Best Buy survived by leveraging scale and investing in services and store experience. Apple began opening its own retail stores, bypassing traditional distributors entirely. Consumers increasingly associated innovation with manufacturers rather than retailers. RadioShack attempted reinvention. It experimented with new store formats, refreshed logos, and rebranding efforts that emphasized mobility and connectivity. It shortened its name to the Shack in advertising, signaling an attempt to modernize perception. These changes altered appearance more than structure. The underlying economics remained constrained by small stores, declining traffic, and rising competition. Debt accumulated gradually. To sustain operations and fund transitions, the company borrowed, betting that stabilization would follow. Instead, revenues continued to drift downward. Wireless commissions tightened. Accessory margins compressed. Online competitors improved logistics and customer experience. Each pressure alone was manageable. Together, they reduced flexibility. As performance weakened, strategic options narrowed. Closing underperforming stores saved some costs but reduced overall presence. Selling assets provided temporary liquidity but weakened long-term prospects. Potential buyers showed limited interest in acquiring thousands of small leases with declining sales. The brand was recognizable, but recognition no longer guaranteed traffic. By the early 2010s, RadioShack was no longer positioned as either a low-cost retailer or a premium experience. Its assortment overlapped with online sellers, big-box stores, and carrier-owned wireless shops. The convenience advantage had diminished as consumers grew comfortable ordering online. The company's historical identity, as a place for electronic curiosity and problem-solving, had largely disappeared. Management continued to pursue partnerships as a way forward. One notable effort involved store-within-a-store concepts with wireless carriers, aimed at stabilizing revenue and sharing costs. These arrangements kept some locations open but further tied RadioShack's fate to external partners, whose priorities did not always align with long-term brand preservation. In 2015, RadioShack filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection for the first time. Thousands of stores were closed. Inventory was liquidated. The filing was framed as a restructuring rather than an end, but the scale of closures marked a decisive contraction. What remained was a fraction of the original footprint and a brand operating under new ownership arrangements. A smaller version of RadioShack continued to exist, primarily through licensing and limited retail operations. The name persisted in some locations and online, but the national chain that once defined neighborhood electronics retail did not return. Subsequent restructurings further reduced presence. The institutional form that had sustained the company for decades had effectively dissolved. RadioShack's decline was not the result of a single miscalculation. It was the accumulation of reasonable decisions made within narrowing constraints. The company adapted but slowly. It shifted categories but not structure. It reduced costs but at the expense of differentiation. It leveraged partnerships but surrendered control. Each choice addressed immediate pressures while limiting future options. For much of the 20th century, RadioShack had been more than a store. It was where components were sourced, questions were asked, and small technical problems were solved locally. Its employees were not engineers, but they occupied a space between manufacturer and consumer that once mattered. As products became sealed, standardized, and remotely delivered, that space contracted. The disappearance of RadioShack did not leave a dramatic void. Electronics continued to sell. Innovation continued elsewhere. What changed was the infrastructure through which everyday technology reached people. A dense network of small, specialized stores gave way to fewer, larger retailers and abstract online platforms. RadioShack lasted as long as it did because its model had once fit its environment exceptionally well. When that environment changed, the company adjusted incrementally rather than structurally. The assumptions embedded in its footprint, inventory, and economics outlived the conditions that supported them. By the time the decline became undeniable, the company was managing its contraction rather than designing its future. What remained was a brand remembered for accessibility and familiarity, and an institutional story defined less by failure than by gradual misalignment. RadioShack did not disappear suddenly. It receded, store by store, category by category, until its role was no longer necessary. The network that once connected consumers to emerging technology persisted longer than the market that created it.